I find myself thinking often about what I might have overlooked, what small signs I might have missed along the way. Little things, tiny details that I should have caught. But back then, I was stuck in my comfortable patterns, too satisfied with what felt like a steady, predictable existence. I've always lived here in Washington. It's a quiet place, peaceful and uncomplicated. The streets never get too busy, and there's always this fresh scent in the air, a mixture of pine needles and damp earth. It's one of those towns where people grow up, settle down, and rarely ever move away. There's comfort in that familiarity, and I guess I took it for granted. My name's Ethan. I'm in my early 40s now, and I've spent most of my adult life doing manual labor, starting out as a trainee at the local garage, eventually running my own place. I fix cars, trucks, pretty much anything that runs on fuel and gears. It's far from fancy, but it's honest, reliable work. The pay's not fantastic, but it's enough for us to get by. Besides, I've never cared much about having expensive things. Sarah and I have been together since high school. She was the kind of girl who caught everyone's attention, the type who turned heads without even meaning to. Tall and curvy, with these sparkling eyes that seemed to hold secrets only she knew. She had this gift for making people feel special, like they truly mattered. I was drawn to her from the moment we met, and gradually, she became the center of my universe. For laughter, the warmth of her touch, the way she'd lay her head on my chest at night. Those little things once meant everything to me. We didn't have kids. We tried, sure, but it never happened. Early on, we talked about the future we imagined, a house buzzing with children's laughter. But eventually, we had to accept that it simply wasn't meant to be. Sometimes I dwell on it, but mostly I chose to push it aside. I wasn't going to let that define who we were. Life was comfortable, not exciting, just steady. I spent my days down at the garage, fixing vehicles and chatting with the regular customers. Sarah worked reception at the doctor's office in town. Not exactly thrilling, but it kept the bills paid. She'd finish work, come home, and we'd eat dinner together, just the two of us. Afterwards, we'd watch TV or talk about our day until bedtime rolled around. Nothing remarkable, but it belonged to us. For years, that routine was enough for me. I never questioned it. But at some point, Sarah began to change. It wasn't sudden, at least not at first. It came on gradually, like fog settling quietly over a familiar landscape. I still remembered clearly when I first noticed something was off. She started staying late at the office, saying there were extra tasks she needed to handle. At first, I didn't worry much about it. After all, she worked at a doctor's office. There were always errands or scheduling issues that could pop up unexpectedly. It seemed harmless, just part of the job. But then it started happening more frequently. She'd get home later and later, appearing exhausted, yet somehow different. There was something in the way she carried herself, something in her eyes when she looked at me. It wasn't anger or annoyance, just something unfamiliar, something I couldn't quite pinpoint. That's when I started noticing the small, subtle shifts. When she looked at me now, her gaze was gentle, yet distant. Where she once greeted me at the door with warmth, affection, and an embrace that spoke of closeness, now there was just a polite hug, a quick peck on the cheek, and then she'd slip away, retreating to the couch or to the bedroom. The closeness we once shared slowly disappeared, replaced by silence and the absence of touch. Some nights, I'd lie awake and watch her sleep. She seemed peaceful, yet there was a certain emptiness in her that I couldn't ignore. I remembered gently running my fingers through her hair, hoping to find that connection again. But it felt as if her body belonged to someone else. She was physically warm, sure, but that warmth no longer reached me like it used to. There were no huge fights, no angry words exchanged. Just this ever-widening distance between us, a gap I couldn't bridge, no matter how much I tried. I'd reach out, but she'd quietly withdraw. Those nights we once spent wrapped together under the sheets now felt like memories belonging to somebody else's life. At first, these changes were subtle, easy to dismiss. But eventually, they became impossible to ignore. Her body, once so responsive to mine, started pulling away. Kisses that once ignited something between us now felt soft, distracted, almost automatic. She'd turn her head slightly when I leaned in, treating my affection like it was just another chore to get through. One evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for Sarah to come home. It was late, much later than usual. I knew her shift had ended hours ago. My mind drifted back to a conversation we'd had weeks earlier, when I'd suggested taking a vacation, something spontaneous to shake things up. Sarah had given me this tired, distant smile and softly said, "Maybe next time." When she finally walked through the door that night, I saw something different in her eyes even before she spoke. Something had shifted inside her, something I couldn't quite identify. She was still beautiful, still my wife, but there was a hollowness about her now, something that didn't belong. She gave me a quick, fleeting kiss, almost like an obligation. Without another word, she took off her coat, moved past me, and quietly headed to our bedroom. I felt it then, the heaviness of everything left unsaid between us. I sat quietly in that silence, trying to tell myself it was temporary, just a rough patch we'd eventually move past. But deep down, I knew better. Something fundamental had already shifted, like the connection we'd built over years had started to come apart. And no matter how desperately I tried, I couldn't seem to fix it. Looking back, I should have spoken up right then. I should have asked Sarah directly what was wrong. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence settle in, allowing the distance to stretch even further between us. The affection she once gave so naturally became just a memory, and I found myself aching for that warmth I once knew. It was gone now, and in my quiet desperation, I started to wonder if I'd ever get it back. It happened slowly, so subtly that by the time I realized it, it had already swept me away. I didn't want to trust what my gut was telling me. I refused to accept that the woman who'd shared nearly half my life was slipping away. But the evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just how she spoke or how she looked at me. It was how she stopped being fully present whenever we were together. I was finally beginning to see it clearly. Her routines shifted. It wasn't just coming home late from work anymore. Now she was spending more weekends away from home, too. At first, I told myself it wasn't anything unusual. Sarah had always enjoyed her independence, visiting friends or taking weekend trips now and then to clear her head. I'd never worried before, but this felt different. She started dressing differently, pulling out outfits she hadn't worn in years. Nothing flashy or over the top, just clothes that made her look effortlessly put together. But I noticed. I saw how she'd glance in the mirror before she left, smoothing her hair, carefully adjusting the hem of her skirt. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. I remember the first time she returned late from one of those weekend trips. Not the very first time she'd been late, but this time felt different somehow. She walked through the door quieter than usual, withdrawn, as if something was weighing on her mind. I didn't ask where she'd been, and she didn't offer any explanation. I made up some excuse to leave the house and head to my shop, convincing myself she needed space. But the longer I stayed away, the stronger my doubts grew. My mind kept circling back to where she'd been, who she'd spent her time with. There was something in her eyes that unsettled me, a look I recognized but didn't want to acknowledge. She was distancing herself, from me, from us. One evening, I recall sitting in our living room, watching Sarah stand by the window as daylight faded outside. Her shoulders were stiff, tension radiating through her posture. She didn't notice me watching at first. When she finally turned around and our eyes met, there was something cold, almost detached in her expression. I knew that look. It was the one she had whenever she kept something hidden. It wasn't like she was intentionally shutting me out. More like she'd already decided that I wouldn't understand. I didn't know how to respond to that. It's strange, isn't it? How you can spend years with someone and suddenly realize you hardly know them. That's exactly how I felt. Like Sarah had become someone unfamiliar to me. I tried reaching out, doing my best to close that gap, but she was always busy. There was always something else, someone else, maybe, that seemed to hold her attention. Whenever I tried to ask questions, she'd give short, vague answers that left me feeling even more unsettled. The longer this went on, the stronger my suspicion became. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her late evenings and weekend trips than she was telling me. As if she had an entire life hidden away, something she felt I had no right to see. I don't remember exactly when the thought first occurred to me, but soon I couldn't shake it. The idea that Sarah might be seeing someone else. Someone new. Someone I didn't know. The thought twisted painfully inside me, but it wouldn't leave. That's when I first noticed him. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd seen him around town occasionally, but never really paid attention. He was a truck driver, one of those guys who passed through town on long hauls, stopping occasionally at the gas station or diner to take a break. I had no reason to suspect he was anything more than another stranger passing through. But then I saw him again, standing by his truck outside the grocery store, talking to Sarah. She was laughing, a real, genuine laugh, not the polite chuckle she gave me these days, but the kind she used to have when something truly delighted her. I brushed it off initially. After all, he was just a guy who passed through town now and then. But something about how Sarah acted around him, the relaxed way she stood, the comfort she seemed to have in his presence, felt wrong. It was like I was watching a private moment I wasn't supposed to see. I started noticing them more frequently after that. She'd casually mention him now and then, trying to sound indifferent. "Oh, I saw Mike today," she'd say, and I'd nod, pretending I wasn't paying close attention. Their conversation seemed innocent enough, nothing openly suspicious, but the tone of her voice changed when she mentioned him. It was clear that she was interested, more interested than she wanted me to realize. And hearing her talk that way made me feel like a stranger in my own home. I should have confronted Sarah. I should have looked her in the eye and asked her directly what was going on. But I didn't. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought that my wife might have found someone else, someone who gave her something I couldn't, was too painful to face. Instead, I just watched quietly. I saw how her smile changed when she didn't think I was paying attention, the gentle way she fixed her hair around him, and how her face seemed brighter whenever she talked about him. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew better. She was slipping away from me, piece by piece. That's when I felt it, a heavy weight in my chest, and anxiety slowly building inside me. My worst fears were slowly coming true, bit by bit. It wasn't a question anymore about whether something was happening. Now it was only a matter of when I'd finally know exactly what. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared to face that truth. I had known for a while something wasn't right. I kept pretending it was just stress, with pressures, or our dull routine getting to us. But the moment reality finally hit, it felt like a blow to the stomach. I couldn't pretend anymore. It happened on a Saturday evening. Sarah told me she was going to visit her sister in the next town. Nothing unusual. She'd made that short trip plenty of times before, usually just for a few hours. I'd never questioned it. I stayed home, spending my weekend as usual, tinkering with a couple of cars down at my shop and drinking a beer alone afterward. But that night, something pushed me to drive into town. The house felt suffocating, the silence too overwhelming. As I drove past the diner, I spotted her car, and parked right beside it was Mike's truck. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I froze completely. I don't know why I didn't just drive away or pretend I hadn't seen anything. Maybe I wanted proof, or maybe I just needed to witness it myself to stop fooling myself any longer. I parked discreetly across the street and sat quietly, hidden from view. I watched Sarah and Mike standing near his truck, talking and laughing with such ease, their bodies casually close in a way that stabbed at my heart. Sarah smiled wide and genuine, a smile she'd stopped giving me months ago. I could even hear her laugh from where I sat, and something twisted painfully inside my chest. And then I saw it. Mike reached out and touched her arm, just a casual gesture, but Sarah didn't pull away. She let his hand linger, leaning in slightly, looking up at him with a softness I hadn't seen from her in a very long time. Their faces were inches apart, her head tilted gently, and the way she moved closer told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just having a conversation, she was connecting with him. My chest tightened, heart pounding furiously as if trapped. I didn't want to see any more. I wanted to look away, to leave. But I couldn't move. This wasn't my Sarah anymore. She belonged to someone else now. Then he kissed her. This wasn't some accidental, hurried kiss. It wasn't like the brief, distracted kisses we'd exchanged countless times before. No, this was deliberate, gentle, intimate. Mike held her face tenderly, and Sarah didn't hesitate or resist. She melted into him, willingly, softly. The kiss seemed to last forever, and right then, I felt my heart cracking, shattering piece by piece. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even move. All I could do was sit in my truck, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, feeling that painful betrayal sinking deep into my chest like a heavy stone. They kissed like they were completely alone in the world. Her hands moved naturally to his chest, pulling him closer with a familiarity I recognized from when she touched me. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing herself fully into his embrace, molding her body to his in a way that left no doubt. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a full embrace, a connection that didn't include me. And right then, I understood. I was now the stranger. Jealousy and anger flooded through me. But beneath it was something darker, a sense of helplessness, despair. The world felt like it was shrinking around me. I wasn't just watching Sarah kiss another man. I was watching my entire life unravel, piece by painful piece. But it didn't stop there. Her hands slowly moved down his chest, lingering, clearly knowing exactly where they were headed. She pressed her body even tighter against him, responding openly to his touch. I watched, stunned, as she pulled him toward the side of his truck, pressing him against it, kissing him again. Harder, more urgently this time. Her hands slipped beneath his jacket, moving with an intimacy I recognized, a rhythm that had once belonged to us, but now belonged solely to him. In that moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to yell, wanted to rush toward them and pull her away from him, but I was frozen in place. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to handle what I was seeing. I wanted to shout, to force her to understand how deeply she was hurting me, but all I could do was sit there, silent and powerless, watching everything fall apart. Instead, I just sat there, frozen, watching helplessly as Sarah gave herself to another man, the way she once gave herself to me, in ways I had foolishly taken for granted. They didn't stop. She didn't stop. I could clearly see them through the window, their bodies pressed together, moving with a slow, deliberate intimacy. Part of me desperately wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I needed to witness this, needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt me. Only when they finally pulled apart could I move again, but by then, it already felt too late. I sat there, stunned, watching Sarah casually wipe her lips, straighten her clothes, and gaze up at Mike with eyes I'd never seen before. I didn't recognize her, the woman who used to laugh with me, who used to kiss me like nothing else mattered. In that painful moment, I realized fully that she wasn't mine anymore. I sat in my truck for what seemed like hours, my hands still gripping the wheel, my heart pounding violently inside my chest. The man I thought I knew, and the woman I loved more than anything, they had betrayed me, shattered me completely. In the overwhelming silence, I finally accepted that I had no choice but to confront reality. Sarah had chosen him. She had chosen him instead of me. I should have walked up and confronted them right then, but I didn't. I couldn't find the strength. Instead, I turned the key, fired up the engine, and drove away. The pain was too fresh, too raw, and I didn't know how else to handle it. When I finally got home, the house felt suffocating. The crushing weight of everything I'd just witnessed, the betrayal, the loss of trust, pressed heavily on me, dragging me deeper into a dark place I didn't know how to escape. I had seen Sarah with him. The image was burned into my mind, impossible to ignore. There was no denying it now. I'd seen my wife pressed against him, watched her gaze at him with the kind of longing she'd never shown me. Their kiss, their closeness, the ease of their connection, it all hit me like a cold, harsh wave. She hadn't even bothered to hide it. Her actions screamed louder than words ever could. As much as I wanted to look away or pretend it hadn't happened, I couldn't. I'd seen everything, and now there was no turning back. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to find some way to process what I'd just witnessed. But none of it made sense. How had we reached this point? How had the woman I trusted with my life drifted so far from me? The woman who once held me tightly, promising a future together. How could she just throw everything away for him? Suddenly, I didn't want to be in her home anymore. The walls of the house, once our safe place, now felt like they were closing in on me. Every room, every picture, every quiet memory we'd shared seemed tainted, like nothing more than a cruel lie. I needed to get away, to find some breathing room. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. When Sarah returned home that night, her presence hung heavily in the air, like a storm about to erupt. I heard her footsteps echo down the hallway, each step making my pulse quicken. When she walked through the door, she didn't look different. She didn't look guilty or ashamed, just empty. Like she already knew exactly what I'd seen, but it didn't matter to her. The woman I'd loved for so many years was gone, replaced by a stranger I barely recognized. She tried speaking to me, but I couldn't hear her. Her words were hollow, meaningless now. What could she possibly say that would undo what she'd done? What excuse could justify the way she'd touched him, the way she'd willingly given herself to someone else? I saw a hesitation flicker in her eyes as she moved toward me, but there was no warmth, no love, just the reflection of someone I'd once known. In that instant, it became painfully clear I no longer meant anything to her. The realization struck me hard, like a slap in the face. Sarah had willingly chosen him, willingly betrayed everything we'd built together. And there wasn't anything I could say or do to change her choice. I wanted to yell at her, demand answers, make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But all I could manage was to stand there quietly, staring at her with detached, empty eyes. I wasn't angry yet. I was too broken for anger. And the worst part was realizing she didn't truly care. The days afterward blurred together. I couldn't concentrate on anything, couldn't hold a clear thought. My mind endlessly replayed what I'd seen, like some cruel movie stuck on repeat. Her hands on him, their kiss, their closeness, so comfortable, so natural, as if they had always belonged together. That thought gnawed at me constantly, slowly tearing apart everything I'd believed in. Day after day, I watched her pretend nothing had changed. But I knew better. I could see the guilt, the shame, the emotional distance in her eyes. But none of it mattered. None of it could undo the damage she'd already done. I couldn't stand being in that house anymore. Not with Sarah there. Not with her betrayal looming over me. The emptiness between us had become unbearable. I spent more time in my garage, retreating into the only thing that felt familiar. But even there, I couldn't escape the images of Sarah and Mike together. For touch, his hands, the lies they'd built without me. That's when I finally understood. I couldn't pretend anymore. It wasn't enough to simply walk away. Letting Sarah go wasn't enough. Not anymore. I needed something more than that. She had taken everything from me, ripped away everything I valued, and I couldn't let that go unanswered. Not now, not ever. Over the next few days, I carefully put together a plan, moving quietly, leaving no trace. I needed her to truly feel what she'd done, to understand the consequences of her choices. But Sarah wasn't the only one who needed to learn that lesson. Mike needed to seal it, too. He deserved the same emptiness, the same hollow ache that had consumed my life since he'd stepped into it. He would pay. They both would. The rage inside me had shifted into something colder, quieter, a controlled anger pushing me forward. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, couldn't keep playing the fool. Sarah had chosen Mike over me, and now it was time for him to realize what it meant to take everything from another person. The plan I developed was straightforward and deliberate. I spent days patiently observing, making sure every detail lined up perfectly. I needed absolute certainty. There was no room for mistakes. It wasn't just about revenge, not anymore. This was about reclaiming control, about taking back the power she'd stripped away from me, and making sure both of them understood the heavy cost of their betrayal. Mike was an easy target. I knew his schedule inside and out. His truck, his stops, the routes he drove. He had no idea what awaited him tonight, that this was his final night on Earth. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, suffocating, intense. It was the silence that made your own heartbeat sound like thunder. But I was prepared. I had waited long enough. I drove to the edge of town, to the truck stop where Mike always parked. His truck sat exactly where I'd expected, under the weak glow of streetlights. I parked farther down the lot, hidden by shadows. My pulse stayed steady, my mind clear. There was no hesitation, no doubt. This was the only way. For a while, I just sat and watched him. He was leaning against his truck, talking on the phone, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Seeing him, this man who had stolen everything important to me, triggered something dark and cold inside. I hated him with every fiber of my being. Images flooded my mind. Sarah's face as she looked at him, the softness of her touch, the intimacy I'd witnessed. Those memories burned in my chest, fueling a rage I'd carried for days. The moment he ended the call and headed toward his truck's cab, I moved swiftly. Quietly, decisively, I approached from behind. He didn't realize I was there until it was too late. I grabbed him by the throat, slamming him hard against the truck's cold metal. His eyes went wide with shock, his hands flailing to push me away, but it was no use. He was unprepared, helpless. There was no scream, no sound at all. I held him firmly, refusing to let go. At that moment, there was no remorse, no hesitation. All I felt was the crushing weight of betrayal, the years I'd wasted, the heartache I'd endured, all rushing to the surface at once. I stared into his eyes, watching closely as the life slowly left his body, as his breathing faded away. But there was no relief in it, no sense of satisfaction. All that remained was the emptiness that had consumed me from the moment I'd seen them together. When it was over, I released him, letting his lifeless body fall heavily onto the pavement. The dull thud echoed like a final note. Standing over him, looking down at the man who had destroyed my marriage, my life, I realized something. It hadn't made the pain go away. It hadn't fixed anything inside me. But it had to be done. I turned away, walking back to my car without a second glance. The night enveloped me, and as I drove home, the gravity of what I'd done settled into my bones. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was the overwhelming emptiness that followed, the icy coldness in my gut. As I drove through the empty streets, the image of Sarah filled my mind. Her face, her touch, her betrayal. She'd never truly know what I'd done, never know the price Mike had paid because of her actions. She'd never understand the darkness she'd driven me toward, the cold reality that had brought me to this moment. But I didn't need her to know. I didn't need her to understand. I'd taken everything from her, from him, and in some twisted way, that was enough. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit the thumbs up button and remember to subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them down in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.